Hello, my name is Deborah Vito Vittorio, and for my Teach 1, I am covering question 9 on comparison of rates. Question 9 asks to construct a control chart showing percentage of healthcare professionals vaccination over time in Brookdale Hospital Medical Center in New York. However, it wants us to estimate the control limits based on a different hospital, which is Presbyterian Hospital in New York. The data sets used for this question are available on Hospital Compare website. We'll be downloading 6 data sets from year 2015 up until 2020, and you can find this in the link below, which will lead you to the Hospital Compare website. Once you have all your data sets downloaded, go ahead and open your Python, and we'll first import our 3 libraries. They're pandas, numpy, and matplotlib. Once you've done that, go ahead and import your files. As you can see, I've dated mine from year 2015 all the way until 2020. And below are my outputs for 2018 and 2020. Please pay attention. In datasets 2015 to 2018, there is provider ID, hospital name, measure start date, and measure end date. For 2019 and 2020, there is facility ID, facility name, start date, and end date. We'll cover these a little bit more in the next upcoming slides. Okay, so we're moving on to filtering our Brookdale Hospital Medical Center. Remember, this question is asking us to build a control chart for this hospital and the vaccination rates. Here I have the hospital name, the measure ID we're using, and a second different measure ID which are used for 2019 and 2020 data sets. I have showed you here my data code for 2015 and 2016. Go ahead and write these in as all along, covering the data sets up until 2020. Remember to switch out the hospital name, the provider ID, measure start date, and measure end dates will be slightly different in the data sets for 2019 and 2020, which you will see in the next slide. Moving on, we'll be filtering the New York Presbyterian Hospital because we're building our upper control limits and lower control limits based on this hospital. So we're still using the same manner, except we've now switched the hospital name. And as you could see, my data set code for 2020 is different because now it says facility ID, facility name, start date, end date, as well as the measure ID. We're using the third one. So that is why I have the MM, which is the IMM_3. Go ahead and do this for your data sets from 2015 to 2020. And you should get that output shown below. All right, now that we have all of our data sets separated for Brookdale Hospital as well as New York Presbyterian Hospital, we'll go ahead and rename the columns for 2019 and 2020 so they're matching with the data sets from 2015 up and all the way through 2018. So go ahead and write these codes in. You'll see facility ID will change to provider ID, facility name will change to hospital name, and start date will change to measure start date, and end date will change to measure end date. All right, now we're going to combine data sets into one data frame for each hospital. Data frame A will contain what is in Brookdale Hospital Medical Center, and then data frame B will contain what is in New York Presbyterian Hospital. As you can see, the output below is just for Brookdale Hospital. Please use the same code as shown above. Before we can perform any calculations, we need to convert our data types. So please convert score into numeric, and remember that is already in percentage. Data for measure start date and measure end date will need to be switched to date time types of data, so we're able to calculate our midway point in the next slide. please follow the same code for Presbyterian Hospital data set, so you're able to use those to calculate the control limits, which you will see in the next few slides. Moving on, I'll be showing you how to calculate the midway. Primarily, I switched the column names from score to rate of vaccination, as you can see, because that will be used for my control chart I'll make. Go ahead and create another data frame so we can organize our data better with rate vaccination in there. So your columns should have provider ID, hospital name, state, measure ID, rate vaccination, measure start date, and measure end date. We'll be using this data frame for the control chart we'll be making. Next, to calculate your midway point, you take the measure start date and add it to the measure end date, and you'll divide by 2. So I will be using the Brookdale hospital data in order to calculate this midway point, and it inserted a column in my Brookdale data frame. As you can see, it has listed it below. Moving on, we'll be performing a few calculations in here to prepare us to build our control limits. Now, first, calculate the average rate of vaccine for Brookdale Hospital. You can use that with the formula .mean, and that'll insert a column in our Brookdale Hospital data frame that we built in the previous slide and inserts the values for you. Next, calculate the rate of vaccination for New York Presbyterian Hospital. As you can see, I'm using my data B rate vaccination.mean, which we'll insert into the Brookdale data frame below. You can see that in the output. Third, we'll calculate the standard deviation for rate of vaccination for New York Presbyterian Hospital. We're doing this because this will prepare us to be calculating our upper control and lower control limits for our chart. For the z-score, we're using 1.96. And finally, to calculate the upper control limits and lower control limits, there is the formula. So you take the average rate of New York Presbyterian Hospital and you add that to the z-stat score and you multiply that by the standard deviation. That is for the upper control limit. For lower control limit, you subtract the z-stat score and you multiply that by the standard deviation. So you can see in my output to my right in the Brookdale final hospital data, you have your average rate of Brookdale Hospital, the average rate vaccination of New York Presbyterian Hospital, your standard deviation for New York Presbyterian Hospital, our z-stat, and our upper control limit and lower control limits we'll be using for the control chart we're about to make next. And now we're ready to plot our data. Go ahead and write this formula in, which will plot our midway point, rate of vaccination, and midway point will be our X and rate of vaccination will be on the Y-axis. The upper control and lower control limits will be derived from the Presbyterian Hospital as calculated in the previous slide, and label your title, your X's and Y-axis. And here are my results for the rate of vaccination in Brookdale Medical Center. You can see that in 2014, it was below the lower control limit, but they peaked up a little in 2015 and then went down a bit, and starting 2017 they increased and they were within the expected range of the control limits. Thank you guys for tuning into my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it.